Okay, thank you. Just to, I guess, begin, we were just introduced. The Northern Ireland Protocol was introduced to the House of Commons on the 13th of June after much speculation. Its stated purpose is enabling the government to deviate from aspects of the protocol. The UK government is justifying this under the doctrine of necessity. What we're going to do this morning is look at both the political, domestic and international implications for this, as well as potentially some of the legal challenges and legal hurdles that the UK government may face in respect of this bill. So we're going to split this morning's session into two. We have our esteemed guest now on the line. And in our first session, which is going to be the political facing session, we're pleased to have with us Professor Katie Hayward of Queen's University, who's a senior fellow of UK in a Changing Europe. We have Sir Peter Westmacott, who's the former UK ambassador to the United States. And we're also pleased to have Martin de Graaf, who's a special advisor at the office of the Vice President Šefčovič within the European Commission. So you're all very welcome. Thank you all for joining us this morning. And we'll maybe just kick off with that first session looking at the political context. So I'll maybe just turn in the first instance to we have an hour and we have about 10 questions to get through. So I'll maybe turn to Hilary Benn in the first instance with the first question.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Stuart. I just want to begin by getting a view from our witnesses about how the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill is seen in Washington and in Brussels. And I wonder if I could ask you first, Martin, about the view from Brussels. You're on. There we go.
Yes, thank you. And thank you so much for inviting me. The view in Brussels, I can summarize, I think, in one word or maybe two words: extremely disappointing. Reason being that we have been talking for a year and 4 months about the implementation of the protocol. We know that there are certain challenges attached to it, but unfortunately the UK government, I think, rather consistently has moved to unilateral actions, ranging from the Internal Market Bill 1, from the unilateral actions and on the grace periods in March of last year, the command paper of July, with several new requests which we had to discuss before, and now the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill. We, from our side, as Commission, as European Union, have set out a number of proposals, in particular on SPS and customs, which can very significantly facilitate trade. These options, these proposals have not yet been fully explored, unfortunately. And even though the Vice President has set out earlier this year a whole roadmap with a series of discussions on these particular topics, there was radio silence from the UK government until we heard the announcement of the tabling of the bill. We still feel that it is that is very disappointing because it would lead us to a way of constant uncertainty if the bill will be adopted, with ministers being able to disapply parts of the protocol as they please, instead of trying to find joint solutions together in order to get legal certainty and stability. So that being said, I think we're extremely disappointed also because we feel that in this day and time, when faced with Russian aggression in Ukraine, we should stand shoulder to shoulder and also protect international obligations, defend a multilateral order based on rules. So in that sense, it's all very disappointing, but our door very much remains open to work together in a constructive way, but not with the bill as it is right now as a threat and as the only solution that the current UK government would foresee.
Okay, that's extremely helpful. Can I just follow that up with this question? As I understand it, the proposals that Commissioner Šefčovič has made would clearly involve fewer checks than the full application of third country checks, but would result in more checks than are actually happening at the moment because of the prolongation of the grace periods. And given that the fundamental problem in Northern Ireland at the moment is there is no functioning assembly or executive, does the Commission think that the proposals that Commissioner Šefčovič has tabled would lead to that unblocking, given the position that the DUP has taken? In other words, does it solve the problem?
Well, I think maybe three points in response. First of all, we see as a great benefit of our proposals that we will come to a joint solution, a permanent solution, leading to legal certainty and stability, not unilateral actions, not having been agreed together. That's the first thing. And secondly, we believe that our proposals go beyond the current period of grace periods. We have proposed, for example, that the trusted trader scheme could be expanded also with companies based in Great Britain, that we would look at the sectors we were applying to it. And there's several other parts where we really feel that these proposals have not yet been fully explored, and it's not a step back in comparison with the situation as it is. It is not for me, from my position, to comment on the position of the DUP.
Yeah.
Just, I think an important point is that our proposals are very much focused on facilitation of trade east-west, which is consistently been mentioned by the DUP as by far the biggest element, and much less so other parts pushed by the UK government.
Okay, that is really helpful, Martin. Thank you very much indeed. Peter, can I turn to you? The view on the Hill and in the administration of the bill?
Well, I can, very happy to try and comment, Hilary, on that. I'm, of course, nothing to do with the British government, and I'm not on the Hill at the moment. But
sure, I understand that, but you've got a great deal of experience, yes.
I do talk to people there and of other nationalities around Europe. I think the shorthand way of putting it is that I think Washington sees this very much in the way that Simon Coveney and the Irish government have. They feel, going back a little bit in up the food chain, if you like, a certain godfatherly, if not guarantor, responsibility for the Good Friday Agreement. They have always been bothered about the way in which the current British government, the one that's sort of on its way out the door at the moment as we speak, has handled that. They, like everybody else, if you like, saw that the Northern Ireland Protocol was something which was a solution put together by the British government to solve a problem of its own making. And they don't buy the argument that it is destroying or damaging to the Good Friday Agreement. They think that it's got problems. I mean, anybody who looks at strict implementation of that protocol, which of course it hasn't been strict, will be aware that it's potentially problematic. But I think in Washington, they take the view this can be fixed. The Commission has made proposals, the Irish government's made proposals, and that the UK does not need to take a unilateralist sledgehammer, if you like, to crack a big-ish nut. I, of course, accept that. So they're nervous that this could be damaging to stability, peace, prosperity in the island of Ireland. I know that the outgoing Prime Minister doesn't really like the argument that President Biden really cares a lot about Northern Ireland, but he does. I've talked about it with him many times over the years, and so does much of Congress. And so I think the short answer, Hilary, to your question is that Washington is very bothered about this, and they will now be looking at the British political scene with considerable interest for lots of reasons, but one of them will be to see, well, what sort of a government and what sort of a prime minister are we going to have, and will they be as determined as Mr. Johnson and Liz Truss have been to push ahead with a unilateralist solution to the perceived problems of the Northern Ireland Protocol, or will there be a different approach? And neither I nor I suspect you can yet answer that question.
No, you're absolutely right about that, Peter. Thank you. That's extremely helpful. Just in the short time I've got left for my questions, if I could just turn to you, Katie, and ask you the question I put to Martin, which was a bit unfair, whether what the Commission is proposing, in your view, could lead to the re-establishment of the executive and the assembly.
Thank you, Hilary, and thank you for the opportunity to give evidence this morning. Well, if we look at what the DUP is asking for, it's for arrangements that would restore Northern Ireland's place in the Union, which it sees as being undermined by the protocol. And in many ways, you'd have to say that isn't something that's sort of in the gift of the EU itself to offer, given that a lot of the concerns around Northern Ireland's place in the Union is for the UK government to reassure the DUP and unionists on. And a lot of it is around principle, I think, rather than the pragmatism. That said, there are a number of issues that the DUP and others have raised with respect to the operation of the protocol that centre upon the areas that both the UK government and the EU have identified, so customs, SPS, etc. And certainly you can see a space there for serious discussions, if not negotiations, depending what you call them, but that we could see an adjustment that could have a material effect, if you like, on addressing those concerns around movement of goods across the Irish Sea. So I think fundamentally, we haven't seen spelled out from the DUP's side exactly what they would like to see, what would be enough, say, in those detailed things of movement of goods across the Irish Sea. They've set out some concerns and some problems, but we don't know exactly what would be enough to see be willing to nominate a Deputy First Minister. Okay, that is really helpful. Thank you very much. Back to you, Stuart.
Thanks so much, Hilary. And the next question from Alison.
Thank you. Yeah, so my question really picks up on something that Peter started talking about, that the UK government has suggested that Brexit and Northern Ireland are primarily domestic issues. What's your view on whether the US and EU would agree with this, or whether it is seen, they're both seen as more international? If we go to Katie first.
So this is the interesting thing around the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, in that it's attempting to have essentially a unilateral solution to what is genuinely an international concern. So the idea that the UK could design and implement arrangements that would manage the external border of the EU single market. So what we have here is an unusual situation in that we don't know. The UK government is saying it's possible to avoid a hard border on the island of Ireland and to not have border checks and controls really across the Irish Sea, with the exception of those goods that go into the Republic of Ireland. So essentially saying it's still effectively being able to scrutinise what's coming into the EU single market itself, according to its own terms and solutions that it itself designs. And we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the bill is difficult to assess, not really just so much because of what it's claimed to do in the immediate instance in excluding certain provisions, but also the capacity that it gives UK government ministers to make regulations that could potentially affect the operation of the protocol, or indeed, of course, the trading position of Northern Ireland going forward. So it's a sort of it's a difficult piece to assess in terms of its overall impact, but fundamentally, at the end of the day, this is around an international agreement, and therefore it's almost doomed to failure if it's assumed that the EU would be at any particular point able to accept this as a sort of a unilateral approach to fixing an international concern, particularly one from the EU's point of view. And just a small point in addition to that, this relates to the bigger question around the Good Friday Belfast Agreement itself. So I don't think you can ever have a unilateral solution to a grave concern with respect to the Good Friday Belfast Agreement. By its very nature, it has to be cooperative British-Irish. And you see that same principle reflected in the need for UK and EU agreement over the protocol.
Thank you. Could we go to Peter next, please?
I think that a quick comment on both Washington and perhaps the European perspective. I think that's exactly right. This is an international agreement lodged at the United Nations, and it is something which deals with the external border of a single market. It is therefore de facto, if you like, a legitimate area of concern for the European Union. It is not a bilateral agreement between Ireland and the United Kingdom, and it's certainly not just an internal United Kingdom debate between Northern Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom. So I think whether or not people like it, some people in Westminster perhaps don't, it is an area of legitimate concern for the European Union for that very reason. Of course, the solution does require very largely political negotiation and hopefully agreement and common course between London and Dublin. But never forget that when it comes to a single member state, there is always something called member state solidarity. And if a single member state has a difficulty with an outside third party, other member states will almost invariably come to their support and help out. And you are therefore dealing with the entity of 27 member states, not just with a single member state. Many people haven't always realized that the EU is, I won't say indivisible, but is an entity when it comes to negotiations, especially areas like trade, which are absolutely community competence, as we used to call it. The second thing is that I think from the United States point of view, yes, they feel that way back in the days when a number of Democratic senators, including one Joe Biden in the 1990s, urged Bill Clinton to take what they called a risk for peace and give visas to McGuinness and Adams and co. to come to the United States. America and Irish Americans have felt a keen interest in what was going on in Ireland, a determination to try to help, as they saw it, bring the troubles to an end. They have had special envoys over the years, some of whom, like George Mitchell, made a real impact. Others have made a bit less, but nevertheless have helped. And so the United States feels a strong political, if not a formal legal, responsibility for what happens, and therefore is concerned about what's going on, which is why we have seen senior members of the Biden administration saying that if anybody thinks they're going to get a free trade agreement while a coach and horses is being driven through the Northern Ireland Protocol, they've got another thing coming. My language, not theirs. But that is part of the political reality. Personally, I've never believed in a comprehensive new free trade agreement between the United Kingdom and the United States because I think it's too difficult and we don't really need it, and we're doing very well without one, but that's a separate debate. But those linkages are established in American political minds. So it is very important, in my view, in the real world, to try to keep Washington on board as we find solutions forward. Certainly Dublin and Washington are in very close contact, and my own opinion is that it behoves London to remain in close contact with Dublin and Washington as well, as we try to find a solution, which I hope is not going to be purely unilateralist, because I don't believe that's going to work.
Thank you. Martin, anything you want to add?
Very little, thank you, because I very much agree with previous speakers. I think the two main points are indeed the mere fact that such a close ally and partner disapplies unilaterally such an important international agreement as the protocol is clearly worrying. And secondly, as a consequence of the bill, and if ministers would actually make use of the competence they would get under the bill, it would mean that basically the UK government would decide what kind of goods would enter our internal market. And if we read the bill correctly, that's not only goods coming from Great Britain, but goods coming from all around the world. And that is clearly something which is of grave concern to us. Because the unique feature of the protocol is, of course, that for the first time, we have outsourced the control of our external borders to a third country, the UK, which requires a great deal of trust, as you can imagine. And that trust is really put at very severe risk if it would be for the UK government, who would be in charge of controlling our internal market, to decide themselves, without any input of us, what kind of goods would enter internal market and which not. So for all these reasons, it is certainly not only a domestic issue.
Yeah, resounding clear answer, I think, from all of you, that it definitely isn't just domestic. Thank you very much. I'll hand back to the chair.
Thanks, Alison. To Claire for question 3.
Thank you very much, Stuart. The UK government make frequent reference to the Belfast Good Friday Agreement in their presentation of the bill, but the Irish government and the EU and the US administration perceive it as being damaging to the Good Friday Agreement. Is that difference in interpretation at the heart of the at the issues around this bill, and what impact will the bill have on that difference in interpretation? Katie, I might go to you on that first, please.
Yes, so the justification given for the approach being taken by the British government on this is because the Good Friday Belfast Agreement is in peril because of the lack of functioning of the institutions within Northern Ireland and North South as well, and that's because of the decisions being made by the DUP, and the reason the DUP is given is, of course, the protocol. In many ways, of course, this is not a wholly unfamiliar situation, and we have known, of course, in the past, in the recent past, a large party in the Northern Ireland Assembly exercising its effective powers of veto over the formation of an executive. It's of course unusual to see it vetoing not having an assembly functioning either. But what's happened in the past, of course, has been that you've had negotiations between the parties supported and enabled by the British and Irish governments. Which goes back to my earlier point around it's not possible to have a unilateral fixing of the Good Friday Agreement, even if we are agreed that the Good Friday Agreement is under considerable pressure at the moment, and even if we accept that there are genuine concerns around the basis of consensus for Northern Ireland democracy going forward, it is not sustainable to fix it unilaterally. It must involve the Irish government and indeed all the other parties in discussions. So I think, bearing that in mind, therefore, we do have a problem in interpreting the Good Friday Belfast Agreement in this way, in its very approach to identifying this problem and then attempting to fix it, which in a way that is very much not impartial, in that it is only addressing the concerns of one particular party in this instance, notwithstanding wider concerns in unionism amongst other parties around the pragmatic issues around the protocol. But this is very directly in response to what the DUP is doing. And therefore it does not sit well with what Boris Johnson himself called the letter and the spirit of the Good Friday Agreement when he negotiated the protocol. So long term, this sets a very bad precedent, I think, for the sustainability of the agreement and the institutions that depend on it.
Thank you. Martin, if you could give us a perspective from Brussels.
Yes, thank you. On the Good Friday Agreement, I think two things. I think first of all, it's very, very important. I think that the whole philosophy of the Good Friday Belfast Agreement very much points towards indeed joint solutions and no unilateral actions. If we want to have sustainable solutions, we need to do this together. Together with the UK government, with the Irish government, and with the European Union, and take into account their interests. And that's the reason why I said in the beginning that we're so very much focused on finding permanent joint solutions instead of a state of constant uncertainty where different UK ministers can take different measures with direct effects on the island of Ireland, but also in the rest of the EU. Which brings me to my second point, is that if we look at the way that the protocol is actually being thought through, there's a whole number of joint bodies where possible differences, possible challenges when it comes to the implementation of the protocol can be discussed. And if I may mention one example, which is sometimes mentioned, it is VAT. that there would be a problem if the VAT rate could not be set in Northern Ireland at the same level as in the rest of the UK. There's a very clear Article 8 with a committee where you can discuss these kind of things. And for example, the example which is sometimes mentioned about VAT on solar panels, our member states have exactly the same challenge and actually charge 0%, just as in the proposals by the Treasury. Unfortunately, these issues are not being brought to the table where we think they could be discussed and solved. And it's very much our hope that in the future that will be done, because I think some of these issues should be much better dealt with technically and sorted out instead of made public without a solution.
Thank you, Peter. A sort of US-based interpretation of the interpretations. You're just on mute. Just need to unmute there.
Sorry, are you asking about interpretations of the GFA, Belfast Agreement, or of the Northern Ireland?
Yes, and I suppose the contradiction in how the UK and other actors are interpreting it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see any major difference between interpretation of the Good Friday Agreement itself. You know, everybody was ringing the church bells when it was finally achieved with such difficulty. And until very recently, until we ended up with a British government which chose to go for a harder version of Brexit than many people thought was wise, I don't think there was much of an issue. It was working pretty jolly well. And I think I would argue that right up till now, partly because the Northern Ireland Protocol has not been strictly implemented, that Northern Ireland has had the best performing part of the economy at the United Kingdom, bar none. So, you know, it's not doing too badly, it seems to me, at the economic level for Northern Ireland. The only thing I would add is that I think that since we have had both the talk of Article 16 being activated and now unilateral UK legislation, it's not so much that people have got different interpretation of the Good Friday Agreement, it is that they've got different interpretations of what the withdrawal agreement of the Northern Ireland Protocol could mean for it, and whether this is the appropriate means of solving the largely technical, I think one could call them, problems that have arisen. That's why the Commission came up with its own proposals. Foreign Secretary Truss has said that the Commission proposals take us backwards. I'm not sure that's how either the Irish government or other EU member states see it. And I think that the view, certainly in Washington and most of the other European capitals, would be, look, if there are some technical issues that need to be fixed as a result of this protocol, which the British government itself has negotiated, then let us do that on the basis of compromise and consensuality to the extent possible, rather than blow it all out of the water. So I think that's the main point. It's not the GFA, it's the problem. The issues of concern are more around what remedies are now being contemplated to fix the problems which are out there and which are perhaps not as great, other people think, as some members of the British government are arguing.
Thank you very much. Back to you, Chair.
Thanks, Claire. Next question is from Caroline.
Thanks very much, Stuart. It's already been made very clear what the EU and what the US think about the protocol bill, but it does look likely that it's going to become law. And I just wondered how you think the broader international community will actually react at the point when it does become law, if it does. And I'll come to Martin on that. I mean, are we looking at, you know, some kinds of retaliation, or what can we expect?
So thank you for this question, but as you can understand, in my position here, have to be a bit careful. This is, of course, something we consult with member states and the European Parliament first. So I think what I can say is what the Vice President, I think, has consistently said when it comes to this issue. Adoption of the bill and effectively disapplying the core elements of the protocol is a very serious issue. And it would mean that the European Union would use the means at its disposal, will not exclude anything at this moment. And as you are aware, the philosophy of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement is very much that it was founded on the withdrawal agreement, including the protocol on Ireland, Northern Ireland. So if you take away the foundation, something will happen with the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. And I think I'm afraid that's all I can say for the moment.
I understand your the dilemma. Peter, are you able to say any more, maybe?
Well, just not a lot, I'm afraid, Caroline. I mean, first of all, I think it follows from what I was trying to say earlier, that if this bill does become law, more or less in its present form, that there will be a pretty hostile reaction in Washington. There would certainly be a linkage to any negotiation that might be in progress on a comprehensive free trade agreement with the UK, but that seems to be pretty stuck at the moment. But more generally, I think there would be politically a very considerable concern. And of course, they would notice that the European Commission would be retaliating one way or another in some form of trade sanctions or whatever it's going to be. We don't know. But I think there would be a degree of despair in Washington. And this is, remember that matters Irish are one of the few areas which do cross the aisle, where Republicans and Democrats frequently see eye to eye. There aren't very many subjects on which they do. Ukraine is perhaps another, but most of the time it's not. But Northern Ireland and everything to do with Ireland is one of those subjects. So I think there would be, a sharp reaction there. And of course, the only other thing I would add is that we don't yet know whether this is going to become law. Of course, it went through the House of Commons relatively easily, more easily actually than I thought it would. It hasn't yet come through the House of Lords, where there's an awful lot of people who know an awful lot about trade policy in Northern Ireland, the European Union, who've got real concerns. And we don't know how much political impetus is going to be behind this bill in the coming months. I mean, it may be that we're going to be going through a period of political hiatus while the Conservative Party decides on who its next leader is going to be and therefore who the Prime Minister is going to be. So things may go quiet for a little while, which might allow the possibility for cooler heads to consider what's going on and whether there are other ways of dealing with this. And much, of course, will depend on not only who is going to be the next Prime Minister, but who's also going to be the next Cabinet Minister responsible for taking this policy brief. And if it's somebody different with a very different attitude, then a number of things can change. So I think there's more uncertainty today on where that's going politically than there was even just a couple of days ago.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks. And Katie, I appreciate it. It's a difficult question, and you're looking into a crystal ball. I don't know if you have any reflections on what might have happened in the past that we can learn from, or any other thoughts.
Thanks, Caroline. Yes, I would just say a couple of things. I mean, if it does become law, we should be very clear it doesn't fix the problems it's intended to solve. So we don't know for sure that the DUP would go back into forming an executive, what the DUP would want to see before it does that. And even if it does, what that has meant for the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, given that the majority, 52 MLAs have written saying they did not want unilateral action on the protocol in this way. Also, it doesn't fix the Irish Sea border problems, as I say, because such a solution has to be agreed with the EU, in that it's almost nonsensical to suggest you could have a unilateral fix to a joint concern. And then more fundamentally, I think perhaps is the question of what this would mean for devolution itself and for the powers being given to ministers of the Crown. And I'm sure this will be discussed by Catherine Bernard, but what it means in terms of the capacity of UK ministers to make secondary legislation and indeed to make regulations that impinge very directly on devolved competences, I think is very, very significant, and that should be noted as being a big moment for the UK, let alone even setting aside the whole thing around potentially breaking international law.
That's really, really interesting and important. Thank you very much. I'll hand back to you, Chair.
Caroline, I know, Paul, you're under some time pressure, so next question from you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Stuart. And I wonder if I can sort of build on Caroline's question. I mean, obviously, those who made the case for us to leave the European Union built it very substantially on the UK's ability to sign new trade deals around the world, benefiting us in our specific circumstances. And I just wonder if our witnesses could reflect on what they think the impact of the bill will be on our ability to sign trade deals more widely, and what it will do for this post-Brexit global Britain brand that the government's developing. Now, I wonder if I could start with Martin, recognizing we already have this CTA in place, but on your wider reflections.
Thank you. It's a bit of a tricky question for me, because it's not for me to speculate on how well the UK will do when it comes to the brand global Britain. I mean, we are in the European Union busy still trying to finalize and improve our own trade deals, as was the case with New Zealand last week. What I can say is, I think, two things. It's not for me to speculate, but I think from our context we notice a certain uneasiness from other partners which may be interested to sign trade deals with Great Britain, and inquiring with us what is happening with this particular bill, and why the UK government, 2 years after its agreement, would like to set aside unilaterally that particular deal that they signed with us. And secondly, I think, unfortunately, these unilateral actions cast a shadow on the way we could cooperate as European Union with the UK in general, because it feeds into a level of mistrust in the political will of the UK government to effectively implement what they agree on, and that is, I think, a real pity. That being said, of course, this is with exception very clearly of the situation in Ukraine against Russia's aggression, where I think we all believe that a very close cooperation with our UK partners has been tremendously useful, and that will certainly continue. But unfortunately, I think there are other areas where we could really improve our cooperation, which are really put at risk by the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill.
Thanks very much for that reflection. Peter, you've already made it clear what the impact would be on the ability and indeed value of an FTA with the US. But could you reflect more widely in terms of the government's ambition for trade deals elsewhere?
I think I could only make a couple of rather simplistic comments, forgive me. One is that, rather as Theresa May was saying in the House of Commons about the bill, quite apart from the legal basis of whether the doctrine of necessity and the rest of it adds up, which is, I think, problematic, there is the question of whether the United Kingdom's international reputation as a government country which respects agreements that it signs is going to be damaging to our ability to conclude other deals, or the willingness of other partners to conclude such deals with us. Now, one can hope that this would be, if you like, compartmentalized and one-off if we go down that route. But she's a former prime minister of great experience, and I suspect she's right, and that's certainly what I hear from others who have been saying to me for 2 or 3 years now, you know, what is the value of the word of the current British government? Because it just seems to be of value for one day until the Prime Minister or somebody else decides the next day that it isn't of any value. And that has consequences, as we say to our children. So I think there's that broader point. On the issue of trade, I'm not sure that it makes a huge amount of difference as such, leaving aside, you know, whether or not people want to sign agreements with us. Overall, we're rushing around doing a lot of free trade agreements. Most of them are either rollover agreements from what we had as a member of the single market and the customs union. 1 or 2 are slightly different. 1 or 2, I'm told, terms of trade are worse. 1 or 2 marginally better, not many. Overall, as we all knew in advance, this has done nothing to make up for the loss of trade in both directions between the United Kingdom and the existing members of the single market that we have left. But that was something many of us knew was going to be a problem. So I don't think that's going to be changed very much by the passage of the bill. So I think it's really, it's about respect for international law, and it's about a respect for the word of the British government if it is going to sign an agreement, rather than practical impact on our ability to trade. The last point, perhaps just picking up what the last speaker was saying, global Britain. I think global Britain, in terms of we're going to be wonderfully prosperous with a whole lot of completely free trade agreements with the rest of the world, and we're going to have even better trading relationships. You know, that was always for the birds, in the opinion of someone like me. But I think we have got a certain amount of deserved credit for the way we have handled on Ukraine, and I very much hope that in other areas of very important foreign policy, priority, like what are we going to do about China? Look at the speech of the head of the FBI and the head of MI5 just yesterday. And what are we going to do about instability and terrorism issues kicking around in the Middle East? I like to think that global Britain will mean something in those contexts, and I like to think that that ought not to be affected too much by what happens in this area. But that does depend both on the willingness of other European capitals to engage with the United Kingdom, and I would say on the British government to go down the route of foreign and security policy cooperation with fellow Europeans in a way which we refused to do in any structured way when we were negotiating a withdrawal agreement, but which I rather hope that reality and Ukraine and Vladimir Putin and China challenges and all sorts of other issues will make ministers think again about that, and not only about where the British national interest lies, but about where we can make a useful contribution, as we have on Ukraine, to other global issues where it's just not right or sensible to leave it to others to carry all the water.
Thanks, Peter. That's very helpful. Katie, your reflections.
Thank you. The only thing I would say is, whatever the outcome for this, it's looking very grave for Northern Ireland. So fundamentally, in any outcome, you'd be thinking, well, when you're talking about the fundamentals, what rules are being applied? What rules are being applied in Northern Ireland? And what border is being enforced? And if you have doubt around that, then it does put doubt over Northern Ireland's future and its trading status. And this is very concerning, not least because if we're looking at polling, we see now 55% of people saying that as it is at the moment, the protocol is positive for Northern Ireland's economy. And 2/3 of people in Northern Ireland are saying that it brings economic opportunities for Northern Ireland that could benefit Northern Ireland if exploited. And that includes soft unionists as well as others. So there's this real sense of potential opportunity here. The one thing that we know that businesses have been consistently asking for is certainty and clarity. And moves like this obviously put those in doubt. And one thing's worth remembering is for the UK Internal Market Bill, which is often pointed to by some as showing that a hard stance works and it pushed the EU to move and give the grace periods, etc. But when that was happening, what happened was the very specific issues that were being raised by businesses and requests being made by business for adjustments, for clarity, for derogations, for mitigations, those were overlooked. They were kind of set aside because it became very political around the specific and limited potential breaking of international law. And those issues that were being raised by businesses that were based on a clear assessment of what the protocol meant and the implications that need to be addressed were overlooked. And I do think we've seen the legacy still of that. And there's a potential of the same thing happening all over again, with the focus on this high-level political issue, whereas in real terms, businesses, some of whom are benefiting from the protocol at the moment, some of whom are struggling, but those particular specific issues are completely set aside. And in the meantime, any such uncertainty only has a negative effect. And that's what I would worry about longer term for any issues around UK's trading status. What does it mean for Northern Ireland, who is purportedly at the centre of all of this?
Thanks very much for bringing us back to that point, and thank you all. I'll hand back to Stuart now.
Thanks, Paul. And the next question is from Charles. You're on mute, Charles. Sorry.
Well, I'm there now. So
Yeah,
sorry about that, Chair. I think we've heard a bit of the background, and I think a bit of the attitudes that people have held towards the government, which has effectively fallen. And I'm wondering if that's going to change much. But I think up until now, we've not seen more active offers of help from the US with regard to Northern Ireland. For example, mediation or an envoy. I mean, this seemed to be part and parcel one of the great things that helped the Good Friday Agreement around, and I wonder why there's been such an absence at this point. And can I put that one to Katie first, please?
Yes, it's a good point. I mean, obviously the US has maintained considerable interest, as has already been mentioned. And I know there keeps being hints that there will be an envoy appointed from the US. Of course, there are a lot of political sensitivities, and the recent visit from the delegation from Congress did have a sort of a divisive effect, sadly, in that even though it was positive in showing interest, I think it did reveal wariness, particularly from certain sections of unionism around engagement from the US. Yes, I mean, the approach from the US has to be made with considerable caution, and I think great sensitivity in the current context. And so it has to be said that, or recognized really, that the US is not necessarily seen in the same way from different sectors of the community in Northern Ireland. And maybe an envoy would be appreciated, but like the idea of a mediation from the US doesn't seem to be one that would necessarily bring about a solution, given the caution from unionists in particular.
Thank you very much for opening the issues on this. And I wonder if I could pass this over to Peter for your comments.
I think Katie is right to remind us of the history of sensitivities about Northern Ireland peace envoys from the United States. I remember years ago, I was twice posted in Washington, most recently as ambassador, but before that, when I was a political counselor, I remember trying to talk to my unionist friends who were deeply skeptical about George Mitchell being appointed by the Clinton administration. I think he turned out to be an extraordinarily effective and fair-minded player, but there was nervousness about it. And it was probably no accident that the general put in charge of decommissioning of weapons when we were busy trying to take away the violence was a Canadian general, General de Chastelain, who I think also did a very good low-key job. So these things are politically sensitive, and we need to keep that in mind. The second thing I would say is that I suspect the answer why have we not had more offers of help, or why is there not an envoy, is that until pretty recently, there wasn't a need. There wasn't actually a real problem going on. The Good Friday Agreement was working. Yes, we've had economic, trade-related, legal-related issues around the withdrawal agreement, Northern Ireland Protocol, the bill, whether or not to activate Article 60, and all that, much of which is part of the implementation of the withdrawal of the United Kingdom from the European Union. But it hasn't, if you like, being something which is dominating the headlines and where an external mediator could make a difference, given that it is very largely about the intricacies of how the single market, the customs union, EU relations with a third party really function. So I suspect that's one of the reasons. I know there's been talk of it every now and again, but if you are going to have an envoy, first of all, it's got to be somebody who's going to make things better, not worse. Secondly, I think there's got to be a reason for it. Thirdly, there has to be a willingness from the different parties to accept, and that includes Dublin and London, as well as the different political parties in Northern Ireland. And I suspect that right now we'd be some way from having that sort of a consensus. Are there pressures, which was the other part of the questions, which the United States can or should or will bring to bear if the bill goes through, or if there is not a willingness to try to resolve the standoff, if that's not the wrong term? I think we've talked about trade, and there clearly could be issues. I don't see any likelihood of the United States Congress slapping sanctions on the United Kingdom for implementing this bill, though I may be missing something, but that I think would be going too far. But you never know. We've got sanctions on exports of Scotch whiskey and aluminium to the United States back from the Trump era, some of which have still not been lifted. So, sanction policy is usually, not always, usually in the hands of Congress, and sometimes extremely difficult to sort out. And you never quite know what the extent of the political pressures can be, especially on something as sensitive as Northern Ireland. So I don't know. Otherwise, I think the main pressures would be conversations from people like perhaps the president, although I gather the President and Prime Minister, outgoing Prime Minister, have not often discussed Northern Ireland. But you've got Secretary of State Tony Blinken, who knows the whole Ireland dossier backwards and extremely knowledgeable and cares deeply about it, as does Speaker Nancy Pelosi and many other political figures in Washington. So I think there would be a lot of people on the phone, not necessarily sending high-profile, visible delegations, congressional delegations like we had recently, but in other ways seeking to, if you like, minimize the damage, because what really alarms Irish Americans of all persuasions is the risk that this begins to fall apart and you end up with violence returning, and then there would be all hell would break loose, both politically and literally.
Well, thank you very much. I think that places a lot of this in context in terms of what the American response is. And I'm going to move this to Martin now to see if he sees any role for the EU or any greater role for the EU as a mediator in this process.
And thank you for the question. I think I can only reply to the second strand of your question. I mean, any pressure that the US could put on the UK government. I think the previous speaker, of course, based on his experience, have summed it up really well. I think just to add it from our side, we've been very intensively engaging with our US counterparts at political level and also at a technical level. Of course, the UK has done exactly the same, but we feel it's important to get our message across, and that we still very much look for joint solutions to find permanent and stable solutions in order to sort this out and refrain from any unilateral acts. And I think also in particular, we've pressed on our US partners that this is not the time to show division in light of everything which is happening in the Ukraine and our joint stand against Russia in that respect. So we feel that that idea of joining together, not showing division, doing things jointly, has been a persistent message that we put across to our US partners, which we hope is also conveyed in that context to the UK government.
Thank you very much. I think with that, I'm going to pass it back to the chair.
Thanks, Charles. And we're on to our last question for our witnesses in the first part of this morning. So the last question is from Claire.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Well, we've touched on it over the last hour, but obviously the UK government is in a little bit of chaos, and we are going to see a change of Prime Minister at some point in the next few months. What effect do you think that has on the current legislation? Do you think that there should be a pause in that, and how should the EU and the US respond to that turbulence? If I could go to you first, please, Martin.
Thank you. I think, of course, the reply to your first question is a resounding yes. We would very much hope and urge to stop pushing through the protocol bill as such. So that is very much what we hope and what we're aiming for. Whether that will happen or not, I really do not know. You're probably much better placed to see what kind of effect that would have on the adoption procedure of the bill as such. So we will follow that very, very intensively the next coming days and weeks. A message in order to restore trust is I think very much based on what I've said before. A sincere hope from our side and believe that we should go back to the table again, look at the challenges, find joint solutions, but not do it under the threat of a unilateral bill. Which would set aside this important protocol, and I think if we could find back a bit of trust in dealing with it and political will from the UK government side to live up what they've promised to, I think a lot is still possible. So I hope I can. I hope on this that I can end on this hopeful note, and thank you much for inviting me.
Peter, your thoughts on the same issue, on whether the bill should proceed, and what message you might have for future prime ministers on this issue?
Well, this is a bit crystal ball department, of course, Claire. We don't yet know, or maybe I'm out of date already, whether this prime minister is going to stay on or whether he will stand down and there will be a caretaker, or he will hand the reins of government to his deputy. I think that's still to be resolved, or it was when I last looked. But my kind of gut feeling is that, given this morning's news out of Westminster, that the government would not be pressing ahead with controversial legislation of this kind, or indeed a number of others, while the issue of party leadership, and therefore who's going to be the prime minister, is resolved. But we can't be sure. It may be they want to get on with this, but it's been driven by a couple of people, particularly with their own political views, and neither of those people is going to have the same political clout from today onwards. So I think we have to wait and see. As for what message to deliver to those people who will be in charge of dealing with the issue of the Northern Ireland Protocol in the British government as we go forward, I would say very simply, look, do not apply inappropriate and damaging measures which make the problem worse rather than better. Be very careful about the legality of what you are doing, and be very careful about destroying the relationships in Dublin, in Brussels, in other European capitals, because other European capitals do care about this, partly because it is a weather vane for how the United Kingdom is dealing with other broader Brexit implementation issues, and Washington, as you try to find solutions. There are plenty of arguments which suggest that this is not the best solution to the problems which are out there. Yes, there are some problems, but there are some technical fixes, and these are not beyond the wit of man. Various people have suggested what they are. So I would hope that whoever is going to be responsible for this in the future will take a deep breath, will stand back, will take a more pragmatic and not an ideological or legalistic view towards trying to solve the problem, and take a bigger view of all the consequences. And bear in mind that as things stand, guess what? Northern Ireland isn't doing too badly. Yes, I know we haven't got the DUP in government with Sinn Féin. That is indeed true. But as you pointed out, Katie, I think it was pointed out, going through with this bill doesn't solve that problem either. So, let us be realistic about what it does do and doesn't do, and let's be very careful not to make things worse.
Thank you very much. Professor Harewood, the last word to you, if you would like it. Have anything to add?
I won't answer your question directly around whether the bill should go ahead, but it would be an interesting thought experiment to sort of imagine the similar position, because I know there's a lot of concern in the UK at the moment around caretaker government, etc. But just to bear in mind, if it was a situation in which maybe there was a snap election and a change of government, and the Conservative Party refused to say that they would serve under a Labour Prime Minister, and you had a situation with no sitting Parliament and no government being formed, and the Conservatives saying that they want the TCA to be scrapped because of the threat to UK democracy. I mean, it's a bit of a stretch, but there's a similar situation here around what we're experiencing in Northern Ireland, and just to recognise the fact that it is very significant that we don't have an assembly sitting, and that has consequences. No new legislation, no scrutiny, no evidence being taken by our MLAs, no common position being formed. And of course, we're hearing it announced even with the from our health minister about the inadequacy of the budget and the uncertainty of the budget. So all of these things, I just would remind everybody that this does have consequences that is affecting people's lives most directly. And eventually the only way out of this is a negotiated UK-EU outcome.
Thank you very much. I think that's true. That's the only thing that's ever worked, compromise and partnership in Northern Ireland. Thank you very much. Back to you, Chair.
Thanks, Claire, and actually just a special thanks to our witnesses on the first panel this morning. You are welcome to stay with us. I appreciate you're all busy people, but you are welcome to stay with us. I think there is no greater challenge at the moment than providing commentary on current political situation, which seems to change by the hour. So thank you so much to Sir Peter, to Katie, and to Martin, who I think has left. And now we're just going to move on to the second part of this morning's session. I'm pleased that we're going to start to look at the legal implications and also the trade and business barriers with a few familiar experts to all of us. So just to introduce, we have Anton Spacek from the Tony Blair Institute, Professor Catherine Bernard from the University of Cambridge, and Frankie Devlin from KPMG Ireland, who look particularly at the VAT and customs piece. So just with the first question, just hand over to Alan Winters.
Yeah, thank you very much, Stuart, and thanks to the panel members. The academic in me wants to do some scene setting first, I think. Yeah, the Northern Ireland Protocol is a sort of a domestic solution to an international problem, and yet, it seems to have advocates. And I wondered if you could sort of explain for us, what's the logic behind this, and where are the flaws in that logic, and where does it leave us if this goes ahead? So perhaps the ladies first, Catherine.
Well, thank you very much, and I think it's a good thing to be the academic in you. So just to provide the context, I mean, this takes us back to the Brexit trilemma, which has been much discussed, which means that you can only have two out of the following three things. You can leave the single market and the customs union, as the UK has done, but that means that there needs to be a border somewhere. And there are two options for where that border could be. It could be a north-south border or an east-west border. North-south would be a hard border across the island of Ireland, which the Good Friday Agreement rules out. In fact, the Good Friday Agreement says nothing about the border, but it's become a shibboleth that it says there should be no north-south border, which leaves one option, which is an east-west border. An east-west border is the border down the Irish Sea. And that is in fact what we have got, because you can't have all of those three things. You can't have leaving the single market and the customs union and having no border either north-south or east-west. And so it was agreed by the Boris Johnson government that we would go for an east-west border, given that they prioritised taking us out of the single market and the customs union, and that there would be no hard border north-south. And so they went for the third option, which is to have an east-west border. However, Boris Johnson tried to erase the difficulties with that by saying there would be no paperwork on goods going from east to west, so from GB to Northern Ireland. And I'm afraid that is fundamentally untrue. And the government knew this at the time because there was an impact assessment drawn up on the withdrawal agreement, which made this abundantly clear. And indeed, there have been checks and quite extensive paperwork on goods going east-west. Not the full gamut of checks, because we've had grace periods, and those grace periods have been unilaterally extended by the UK government. The EU started enforcement proceedings against the UK for unilaterally extending those grace periods, and then suspended those proceedings last summer when they hoped some sort of negotiated settlement could be reached. And then they have reinstated those proceedings now following the introduction of the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill. And in summary, and I will stop on this point, but what does the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill do? Well, the Northern Ireland Protocol itself said, essentially, I simplify, that there will be a border down the Irish Sea. It doesn't say that in terms, but that's the effect of the provisions. And it also applies the full EU enforcement mechanism. So that means that there will be the power for the Commission to bring proceedings against the UK and the possibility to bring a case to the European Court of Justice. And what the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill does, again, I simplify, but turns off almost all of the provisions, at least half and probably more than that, but at least half of the provisions in the Northern Ireland Protocol. Remember, there are only 19 provisions in the Northern Ireland Protocol, and at least half and probably more have been turned off or potentially turned off, including the provisions on enforcement. And therefore that will drive a coach and horses through the Northern Ireland Protocol, which was the carefully negotiated solution to the Brexit trilemma.
But just to sort of extend the technical discussion, we're proposing domestic legislation, essentially to change the terms of a treaty. In a sense, is that in the rules? Under what circumstances is it or is it not permissible?
So thank you for that, Alan. Under UK domestic law, it is absolutely compatible with our constitution to have the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, because under the principle of parliamentary sovereignty, a later act in time prevails over an earlier act. And therefore the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill repeals part of this is where it gets slightly complicated, both the EU Withdrawal Agreement Act 2020 and the EU Withdrawal Act 2018. And that is totally compatible with our constitution. Because we're a dualist legal system, our law operates at two levels, domestic and international level. And as I've said, at domestic level, it is lawful. And this is the argument that Suella Braverman made. But the more interesting question is it a breach of international law? Now, when the UK government tried that, something rather similar with the Internal Market Bill, they conceded it was a breach of international law, and eventually those clauses in the Internal Market Bill fell, and not least because of pressure from the Lords. This time round, the government has said it is not in breach of international law, and they're relying on Article 25 of the International Law Commission articles on state responsibility. And Article 25 is about necessity, and the UK government says it's necessary to have this bill in order to deal with the problems on the ground in Northern Ireland, which Katie Hayward's been discussing. The trouble is, if you look at the text of Article 25, it sets the bar very high indeed. There's got to be grave and imminent peril. And the fact that the bill will take perhaps a year to get through Parliament suggests that there isn't grave and imminent peril. And therefore, most lawyers do not think that the government's argument based on Article 25 holds water. And therefore, they would argue, and I would agree with this, that there is a breach of international law. Now, the other item that's floating around, this is why it's quite complicated, is Article 16. Now, Article 16 is in the Northern Ireland Protocol, and it does allow the government to act if they think that there are societal, environmental, or difficulties or trade diversion. And for a long time, the government has been playing around with the idea of invoking Article 16. The problem is Article 16 is very limited in scope, and it envisages a sort of surgical strike rather than a whole-scale rewriting of the protocol. And what's striking is if you look at the very brief statement that the government put up on its website about the legal justification for what it was doing with the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, the statement says we're relying on Article 25 of the International Law Commission, which I've just explained, and then they make a brief glancing reference to Article 16, but suggest that they're not actually relying on it. Had they relied on it for a surgical strike, that would have been lawful under international law and domestic law. But it would, in order to use Article 16 to rewrite the protocol, that is beyond the scope of Article 16. And I think that's why the government rightly did not rely on Article 16, because Article 16 cannot be used, for example, to remove the role of the European Court of Justice, because the European Court of Justice has not yet been engaged in anything under the protocol. So it's very difficult to argue that the role of the Court of Justice has caused societal difficulties. And indeed, polling suggests that nobody in Northern Ireland has been worried about the role of the European Court of Justice. So therefore, Article 16 cannot justify the breach of international law. And I think the government has recognised that, which is why they've fallen back on Article 25. But I also don't think Article 25 is strong enough either to justify what they're proposing. And just to be clear, what they're proposing is a total rewrite of the Northern Ireland Protocol.
Thank you very much, Katie. Anton, do you have anything to add to that?
Thank you very much, Alan, and for the Commission for the invitation to this session. What I would add is just two very brief comments. One is that when I was part of the negotiating team in the early autumn of 2019 as an official, as a civil servant, it was clear to everybody involved in the negotiation that the consequences that we are seeing right now, both political consequences, but also economic consequences, would be the result of the arrangements that were agreed and proposed by the current Prime Minister. And I would just like to repeat that the arrangements that we have right now were proposed by the current Prime Minister and his advisors. It was not something that came out of Brussels or Dublin or anywhere else. The idea that there would be some common regulations that would apply to Northern Ireland and the rest of the EU, which would be European Union law with respect to at least food products, was an idea that came from London. The rest was, of course, subject to the negotiations. But to argue now, as some people do, that the protocol was signed under duress and also that it was all forced onto the UK is simply untrue. The second comment I would make is that, and Catherine has set out the spectrum of legal options here and the arguments for and against using the doctrine of necessity as a way to justify a potential breach of international law. What I would say is that it does create, this bill, if implemented, would create a conflict between the UK's obligation on international plane and domestic law. And I think this conflict would really come into sharp focus if there was a dispute between the European Union and the United Kingdom of the legality of this action. So it's not inconceivable that the EU would challenge this bill and seek an arbitration, seek to form an arbitration panel that would decide on what basis that those changes that the government has proposed are implemented. And in that case, it would be very, very difficult, I think, for the UK government to argue that that doctrine of necessity does provide sufficient justification for the changes that they seek. The main problem, I think, is the one that Article 25, which Catherine mentioned, makes very, very clear that all options must be exhausted before using doctrine of necessity. And of course, Catherine mentioned Article 16. It is the Article 16 for all its constraints is in the protocol and is lawful mechanism for dealing with some of the immediate difficulties that arise from the implementation of the protocol. So I think that would be a very, very, very strong argument that would be very difficult to dismiss by government lawyers, and I think would create a real conflict between the obligations that the UK has on the international stage and domestic law. And just to give you an example of how this conflict might play out, very briefly, is there is going to be a consent vote on the protocol in 2024 where the Northern Irish Assembly will vote on trade-related parts of the protocol. Now, the question is, would they vote on those parts of the protocol that are implemented in UK domestic law, which would be quite different from the actual obligations on international law, or under the protocol as part of the withdrawal treaty, which would stay unamended? We don't know at the moment, but those are the kind of real conflicts and tension that would arise from the kind of differences that there will be between the UK's international and domestic obligations.
Thank you very much. Frankie, do you want to add something further?
Just a very quick comment. As neither an academic or a lawyer, I think the only point I would add is, I suppose, the conflict or the contradiction in terms of turning off certain elements or disapplying certain elements of the protocol, but other elements of it still being intact. So obviously one of the big issues for Northern Ireland businesses that are exporters is that free movement of goods into the EU, which is part of the reason why some of our exporters are doing really well. So again, it's that conflict in terms of how you square that. And obviously what the EU's response would be to that in terms of having some elements disapplied, but other elements still being implemented.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. That's all very useful and very interesting. So back to Stuart.
Thanks, Alan. They were very insightful answers. We let time run a little bit in the first question. Just be conscious of that. I was happy to, but just be conscious of that for the remaining questions. So next question, just from Deborah.
Thank you very much, Stuart. We've been looking at a fairly high level in relation to international law and its interrelationship with domestic law. So if we can now kind of come down a bit to customs arrangements. So my understanding is that there has been quite a lot of commonality between the UK and the EU in relation to proposals on customs to apply different treatment to goods from GB that stay in Northern Ireland or go into the EU. firstly, is this correct? And if so, why have the two sides not been able to come to an agreement? We heard in the previous session that some of this actually could be technical and could be sorted rather than going off and tearing up a bit of international law. So what is actually going on here? Can I first start with Catherine and then go to Frankie?
So I think what we can say about customs is that, I mean, from the EU's point of view, the Northern Ireland is very much in the customs union, and it says it in the protocol, and therefore the custom code applies. Now, that means that goods coming from GB are essentially goods coming from a third country, and so need to be subject to the full customs regime. But what we also know is that on the ground, it's not always being applied with the level of rigour. And I think Mr. Devlin can talk in more detail about that. But it's also clear that this is causing upset on the ground. We know about the DUP's position. And so the question then is, could we have some sort of arrangement where you have a green lane and a red lane, or what the EU calls an express lane, or not? It works very well for large companies, the supermarkets, which have very good tracking mechanisms. What becomes more difficult are for the next level down companies, who are supplying to wholesalers in Northern Ireland, but also into the south, and trying to track which goods stay in NI and which go on to the south becomes much more difficult. And then there's a tier below that where you've got perhaps what I might call the white van man or woman bringing stuff in, and where all of that goes becomes even more of a problem. Now, I'll hand over to Mr. Devlin to give some more detail on how this actually works from his point of view.
Can we also just think about whether there are technical solutions in all of this? So perhaps, Frankie, you can pick up that aspect as well.
Yeah, thanks, Deborah. Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, I mean, I suppose there are certainly some overlaps between the UK's position on green lane, red lane, and the EU's position on express lane. But they certainly, on a lot of the issues, they're definitely not on the same page, and often, you know, they're not even reading the same book, because I think, as Catherine mentioned there, the big issue is whenever the goods come into Northern Ireland, the EU's position on that and the protocol's position on that, because it's quite black and white in the protocol that EU rules apply. So the Union Customs Code applies, the EU's regulations on SPS apply to those goods when they come into Northern Ireland from either GB or rest of world. So the green lane concept doesn't really, you know, it doesn't deal with that, because the green lane concept is effectively disapplying all of those EU rules in respect of green lane goods. So even leaving aside where those goods ultimately end up, because I suppose it is possible that green lane goods could potentially end up in the EU if someone misuses that green lane, or if they just don't know where those goods are going to go to. But there is a fundamental difference between the EU's position and the UK's position there, because EU says EU rules apply whether they're green lane goods or red lane goods. The UK's position is EU rules only apply to red lane goods. So I think there's a big difference and a gap between the two parties there. And again, there have been negotiations which sadly haven't happened for a number of months now in any great detail. But even whenever the parties were discussing that, there does seem to be a really fundamental difference there. And I really don't know how you would square that circle unless the EU compromise and concede on that point, which effectively is, well, I don't want to say rewriting the protocol, but it is certainly a significant move away from what the protocol currently says in black and white. So in terms of fixes to it, Deborah, I would say that certainly in the business community, businesses want this to work as simply as possible. And therefore, the green lane concept, we believe, does have a lot of logic, does work for a lot of sectors, particularly those retailers, the consumer-facing businesses where they are selling from premises in Northern Ireland to consumers who come to their stores. So we really see the logic in that. In terms of the other sectors, processors, manufacturers, exporters, it is much more difficult, obviously, because there is a big reliance on self-compliance in using the green lane, red lane appropriately. So as a business community, we would like to see some of the green lane concepts being implemented, but the problem is the protocol does not provide for a green lane, and therefore that would require EU to agree to that, which requires negotiation and compromise. And obviously that is not where we're at the moment.
Thank you very much. For time reasons, I'm going to hand back to the chair.
Thanks so much, Deborah. And the next question is from Charles.
Yes, this is a bit more of a granular question, and I just wonder, what are the immediate priorities for Northern Ireland businesses in terms of the protocol, and to what extent are they addressed by the protocol bill, or would there be better alternatives? And can I put that first to Frankie?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the immediate priorities for businesses, it's certainty and stability, which is what they've been calling for throughout all of this, because there have been a lot of significant changes, rule changes, which businesses have been doing their best to get their heads around, and putting in new resources, new systems to deal with that, because businesses will find solutions to problems. But again, the uncertainty and instability, and is how long is the protocol going to be in play? Will this bill override certain sections of it? So again, that is not good for business. It's not good for our local businesses. It's not good for foreign direct investment opportunities. So really, certainty and stability are the immediate priorities for business, because they just want to get on with the day-to-day business. They don't really stay awake at night thinking too much. I think about what clause 7 says in the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, or those types of things. Some of them might well do, but really it is the day-to-day bread and butter issues. They don't think about whether the Irish Sea border is a constitutional issue. Again, it's really what does that mean for my business? Can I deal with the practical administrative burdens of dealing with what Brexit has thrown up, which is paperwork? So again, there are those key issues. In terms of flexibilities, as I've mentioned, businesses do want flexibilities. They do want the EU to be more flexible, more pragmatic in the implementation of the protocol. In terms of the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, obviously Catherine has made the point that in her view it is a breach of international law. I hope I haven't misquoted her there. So I think businesses in general would not be happy with trading on the basis of breaching international law, because it's bad for Northern Ireland's reputation in terms of selling into other markets. So that's not good. So I think what I would just finish up saying, certainty, stability, and a negotiated agreement with the EU is really where this needs to get to.
Thanks very much. I wonder if I could ask Anton to come in here and comment on the immediate priorities for Northern Ireland.
Thank you very much, Charles. And what I would add just to what Frankie was saying is that what we are seeing at the moment is not really the full implementation of the protocol. We have to remember that at the moment a number of grace periods are still implemented unilaterally, but they're still
So I've lost the.
Yeah, he's frozen, Charles. He's going to be back with us now.
Are you back?
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thanks, Anton.
Apologies, I think my connection here is a little bit unstable. So I was just saying that there is quite a big difference between what we are seeing right now which is the protocol not being fully implemented, and what would happen in the future when we have implementation of the protocol with the full range of checks on SPS goods, parcels, and everything else that has to happen strictly under the terms of the protocol. And clearly there's a big difference in the view of the Commission and the UK government on how to approach this question. And the Commission has just launched or relaunched one legal action with respect to grace periods, but also launched 2 new legal actions. One is on the idea of non-implementation of SPS parts of the protocol and not implementing the border control posts, and the other one is on data exchange. But I think, you know, the presumption in all of that is that we should be aspiring to implement the protocol in full. So I think there is some merits in saying that, you know, one of the implications of the Commission's proposals last October would be actually a little bit of a step back in terms of the practical impacts from what we are seeing right now. It would most definitely add to the burden that businesses are facing in practice. That is not to justify the approach that the UK government has taken. It is just a statement of fact. But also, you know, what businesses want, and Frankie, I think, described it really well, is certainty and predictability. And at the moment, with all these very high stakes over the politics of the protocol, it is very difficult, I think, for businesses to make long-term decisions on investment, on things which could benefit them and their easier access to the single market, but also UK market. So I think the danger that we have at the moment is that we just don't really know what will be the baseline scenario for the next couple of years, and the businesses are operating in quite a lot of uncertainty about what might or might not happen.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And Catherine, do you have anything to add on this?
Yeah, thank you. Can I just make 3 points? The first one is, of course, business has already made significant adaptation. For those who are importing from GB to Northern Ireland, they've had to introduce all of fill out all the forms and introduce all of the checks that they need to do. So they've already incurred significant costs. Even for a small business with about 9 staff, will probably have had to employ an extra person just to sort out the paperwork. Second point, the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill is an exercise in complexity, because it's not just turning off the provisions, but it's giving significant powers to ministers to make secondary legislation, the content of which is not clear, and indeed the content of which is meant to be discussed with local businesses to try and sort out its content. And therefore, what you'll find is you've got significant powers in the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill to implement regulations to give effect to the government's new plans, but the timescale for all of this is not clear. And of course, it presupposes that there has been discussion and they know exactly what's going to go into those regulations, which creates a further tier of uncertainty on top of the uncertainty generated by the bill. And my third point is, from talking to various Northern Ireland business, I was in Brussels last week, there seem to be about 10 areas where there are particular problems, which no doubt those from on the call know very well. Things like seed potatoes, things like parcels, things like veterinary medicines. Now, in a more, if there was a higher level of trust between the two sides, the sensible thing would be to go through each one of those areas of particular problem and try and sort out a solution rather than rewrite the whole protocol. And at the moment, we know that the EU will not be giving the Commission a new mandate, and therefore the Commission cannot negotiate something completely different to what you find in the Northern Ireland Protocol. But do remember the powers in Article 164 of the Withdrawal Agreement, which allows the Joint Committee to try and sort out things on a case-by-case basis. And what's really striking is that the Joint Committee has not met since February 2022. And you would have thought that over an issue as salient as the Northern Ireland Protocol, they would have been meeting very, very regularly indeed. But what we know is it's just all ground to a halt.
Thank you very much. I think we've learned quite a bit from this question in terms of the instability of the situation and the urgent need for solutions, and solutions which last long enough for business to plan. But with that, I'm going to hand back to the chair.
Thanks, Charles. And I think just from Northern Ireland business perspective, there is that request that there is at least agreement in the first instance on what the problem is. And I think that's where the first step has to come. Next question is from Jeff.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just to pick up on some of the granularity that Charles mentioned, the implications of the regulatory regime for Northern Ireland are interesting for all of us. I just wondered, would the panel like to comment on how they think things might work and give us some examples on the impacts on different businesses and sectors, please? Catherine, would you like to start? Because you'd actually started that conversation already. Could you give us some examples of how things might work, please?
Well, thank you very much for that. We know that there have been problems that may not have been anticipated in 2019. There were particular problems, for example, over human medicines. And it's the one area where the EU has unilaterally regulated in order to try and address that problem. And that problem does seem to a large part resolved. But the other side of that equation is, what about veterinary medicines and medicines for animals? And that part has not been addressed. Now, given that there was goodwill to find a solution for human medicines, you would imagine it would be possible with goodwill on both sides to negotiate something similar and for the EU to legislate to address those issues. I've mentioned seed potatoes, most of which apparently come from Scotland. There is a real issue about getting seed potatoes into Northern Ireland, where of course potato crop is so significant. There are issues on parcels, getting parcels from GB to Northern Ireland. There's also issues about pets. Someone from Scotland wanting to go on holiday to the wonderful Giant's Causeway, and problems about taking their dog with them. The fact is that they have to get the full vet checks in Scotland with the significant cost that entails. And you can see that creates tremendous aggravation. So it's areas like that there are issues. I think everyone agrees there are issues, but they could be sorted out on a case-by-case basis in the same way that some of the issues around human medicines were successfully resolved.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I think the question of the land bridge with Scotland will leave for the moment. Can we just pick this one up, Frankie? Can you just give us some examples of how things might work? The idea being this dual regulatory regime.
Yeah, I mean, again, what I would say initially is, in order for it to work in the long term, we really would like to see the EU or an agreed negotiated position with the EU, because again, I suppose the dual regulatory regime, effectively, we can see how that could work for certain sectors. So again, the retail sector, where they are customer facing Northern Ireland consumers, we can see how you could have potentially a UK standard for certain products that are only being consumed in Northern Ireland, or maybe being sold back to GB again. So in principle, we can see how it can work. We can see the benefits of all of that. But again, that we think it requires EU agreement. Otherwise, there's a problem. And obviously, it's contrary to what the protocol says in terms of SPS. In terms of other areas, other sectors, it does become much more challenging. So farming, agri sector, manufacturers, processors, all of those businesses that are taking in goods from GB, rest of world, again, whether they go through a green lane, red lane, again, you would expect that in order to, under the regulatory regime, meet the standard of being UK standard only, they would have to come through green lane. But again, it's more complicated than that, because a lot of our processors want to sell into European markets, so they need to have ingredients and parts which are of EU standard. in order to comply with those requirements. So again, there's a lot of complexity in like the dairy industry, where milk is moving up and down, north, south for processing on a daily basis. Again, if you are feeding animals that are involved in that process with wheat or grain, which is of UK standard, but maybe not EU standard, that potentially taints that whole supply chain. And therefore the reputational risk for Northern Ireland is challenging. So we can see how it could work for certain sectors. It's more challenging for others. I'll maybe leave it there.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Anton, anything to add, please?
The one question I would add to this is the question of competition and what would happen in the instance where you have a regime of two potentially competing standards for the same kind of products. And it's something that is not dealt with in the bill at the moment at all. It's something that would have to fall under probably the UK internal market legislation. But I think this regime does potentially create quite a lot of difficulties for competition within the Northern Irish market, but also within the EU single markets, if you do allow some goods that have been, if you allow some goods of GB standards to be placed on NI market without sufficient surveillance. So I think those questions are just, it's just one question that I think this whole bill and arrangement raises. But I think it's a really important one, because if you're a business, you do want to know if you're not going to be undercut by a different business producing to a different standard. But that would be one of the implications of this bill. So I think there is just so much, there is so little clarity in the bill about how it would deal with these quite fundamental issues that underpinning the market, but also any durable trade arrangements that could actually last for some time.
Fundamental challenges going forward. Sorry, Catherine, I beg your pardon.
No, forgive me. I just say, could I just add a very small footnote? The EU experimented with what they called optional harmonization back in the 1970s, which I can see Alan smiling wryly. You can probably remember that. It was not exactly a glorious period in the EU's regulatory history. And optional harmonization was just what we were just talking about, that you could opt to make goods to comply with EU standards or domestic standards. But they abandoned it pretty quickly because they realized that it became very difficult to monitor what was happening to goods which had been made to domestic standards only, and what was going to happen when those goods went from state A to state B. And so it does make me smile that what goes around comes around, but the lessons, as we keep discovering from history, don't get learnt.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Chair, back to you, please.
Thanks very much, Jeff. And then on to Hilary for the next question.
Thanks very much indeed. Catherine, hello. Just like old times. I wanted just to pick up the point you made about what the Commission did on medicines, because the Commission has said we are not changing the protocol. But when the medicines problem reared its head, they changed EU law to fix it. Now, is that a potential way in which the Commission could combine, we're not changing the protocol, with solving some of the problems after a sensible negotiation by changing their law in other respects to deal with some of the very particular issues? Because I agree with you completely. There's a range of, you said, I think about 10 of them. That's what the problem is about. And do you think that that is a potential way forward?
Thank you. Absolutely. And yes.
Right. Okay.
And the reality is we are on the edge of EU competence. I use that in the legal sense of the term, as you absolutely understand. The EU can only act where it's got the legal competence to do so. And therefore, that's why they're very worried about stepping outside the four corners of the protocol. But what they did with medicines was they adopt a regulation to deal with that specific issue, which they are free to do, and it goes through their usual legislative processes. The other thing, I just had a further look back at the text of Article 164 of the Withdrawal Agreement, which is the powers of the Joint Committee. So that's the Joint Committee, that's the political body set up under the Withdrawal Agreement to address problems. And those powers do give the Joint Committee the power to prevent problems that arise under this agreement or resolving disputes, and to adopt decisions and make recommendations. There is a reasonably broad amount of wriggle room, I think, under Article 164. No, it doesn't mean you can rewrite the protocol entirely and take out the role of the Court of Justice, but to deal with those 10 or so very stubborn problems, I think there's quite a lot of flexibility, but of course it requires a build-up of trust, and as we know, that is also the problem. But just to go on the Article 164 point, this goes back to something Anton raised much earlier on, that it was always puzzling to me why the UK didn't even start proceedings under the dispute resolution mechanism under the withdrawal agreement. And as you know, the general dispute resolution mechanism is a political agreement, political consultations, and then off to arbitration. Now, if the UK was really serious about sorting out the problems on the ground with the protocol, why they didn't say, you, the EU, are not cooperating, you, the EU, are not coming up with solutions, and therefore we start this process, the dispute resolution process. And just to remind you, of course, there was a dispute resolution that the EU started against the UK over solar panels, nothing to do with Northern Ireland Protocol. And that got resolved last week through the political dialogue stage. So it is a way forward.
Now that is really interesting, because that's the first time I've ever heard anybody raise that as a way forward. Well, you bring me very neatly onto the question I wanted to ask about ECJ jurisdiction. Which the government has elevated now to a point of principle, having accepted it being written into the Northern Ireland Protocol at the time it was agreed. Is its removal or putting the ECJ bit in a different place, in a different dispute resolution mechanism, realistic or feasible?
So thank you for that. So from the EU's point of view, the solution that you find in the Northern Ireland Protocol is 100% understandable. They say it's our rules and therefore they should be enforced by our institutions. Now, of course, that's a unique solution from the Northern Ireland Protocol situation. But elsewhere in the withdrawal agreement, there is a general dispute resolution mechanism, the one I've just referred to. And the general dispute resolution mechanism operates slightly differently. And that general dispute resolution mechanism more closely mirrors a standard FTA dispute mechanism, which is political consultation, arbitration, and then remedies of some sort. Now, what's interesting about the withdrawal agreement dispute resolution mechanism is its political consultations, arbitration, and a trip to the ECJ if a point of EU law is at stake. And at one stage, it looked like the UK was advocating that general dispute resolution mechanism should be applied right across the withdrawal agreement, including to the Northern Ireland Protocol. They now seem to be saying, actually, we don't want any of that. What we want instead is the dispute resolution mechanism that you find in the TCA, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which has no role for the ECJ at all. And that the mechanism that you find in the TCA, I somewhat oversimplify, is political consultation, arbitration, remedies, and the ECJ has no role at all. From the EU's point of view, they say it's totally unacceptable because these are our rules, our as in EU rules, and they should be enforced, and they can only be enforced by the ECJ. Yeah. So therefore, the most plausible way forward would be to extend the general dispute resolution mechanism in the withdrawal agreement right across the withdrawal agreement. But again, that would require a revision to the protocol.
Yeah, I mean, no one would argue that if there's a debate about what EU law says, that the ECJ is the place you have to go. But the thing about the protocol, as the medicines example demonstrates, and the changes that Commissioner Šefčovič is proposing, is how you then particularly apply them to the very special case of Northern Ireland is a different matter. And what I'm interested in is how the government gets itself out of the hole. What a solution looks like in relation to the ECJ. I mean, we've also got VAT and state aid, and some of this is theoretical because we haven't got any cases at the moment apart from the action that's being taken against the government for the things it's done, which the EU thinks is unlawful. But I just wondered whether legally there is a way of kind of separating them a bit, where you say, well, the ECJ can rule on what the law is, but then how we choose to apply that to Northern Ireland, well, that depends on what we agree. And is there something you could construct? And you've drawn attention to the two different alternative methods that are to be found elsewhere in the agreements that were reached. And I suppose I'm just wondering whether an outcome might rest on one or other of those. You've ruled one out, but the one where there can be a reference, is that a potential way forward?
I've always thought it was the best way forward.
Right, okay.
And I think what's caused the absolute fury about the ECJ was when the EU started enforcement proceedings against the UK over the unilateral extension of grace periods. Yeah. And these enforcement proceedings are under Article 258 of the treaty, and it allows the ECJ to say, you, the UK, are in breach. And if the UK doesn't rectify it, then a second round of proceedings can be brought, and we can be fined and subject to a lump sum penalty payment. And those payments are really quite significant. And I think that's what caused the neuralgia over the ECJ. Now, the other way that a case can end up before the ECJ is through what's called an Article 267 preliminary reference. And that's a much more pure approach to EU law. And under Article 267 references, the Court of Justice rules on an abstract point of law, and then the case comes back to the National Court to apply it to the particular context. What the UK seems to really hate is the possibility of the Article 258 enforcement proceedings, which is what Article 12 of the Northern Ireland Protocol carries on applying to Northern Ireland.
Okay. All right, that is really helpful. Thank you so much. Back to you, Stuart.
Thanks. And just to Hyle Williams for the next question.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. My first question is to Professor Barnard, really, and I think we've already had the answer in your response to Alan Winters earlier on. But I've heard government ministers in the chamber saying that this is a matter of a limited small set of changes to the treaty. Whilst of course others think it is a fundamental rewriting, which I think as well. So which is it? One or the other. I think I know your answer. And secondly, if it is a breach of international law, and I suppose it is, what are the consequences broadly, or even at the very broadest, the broadest sense for the UK?
Thank you very much, Hal, for that helpful question. It is not a light dusting of the Northern Ireland Protocol. It's a fundamental rewriting of the protocol, leaving only largely Articles 2, 6, 18 intact. So I think it is a significant rewriting. In answer to your question, if it's a breach of international law, which I think it is, what can happen? Well, that's rather interesting. So, first of all, the points to note, as Anton indicated already, in fact, the EU has done nothing so far about the bill being tabled, but it could, and it can go down two routes. It can start enforcement proceedings under Article 258, which is what I've just described to Hilary about the Commission bringing proceedings against the UK. Secondly, the EU could also start the dispute resolution procedure under the withdrawal agreement, which is political consultation, arbitration, and then remedies. And the interesting thing about the remedies is that the remedies link the withdrawal agreement compliance to the trade and cooperation agreement. And that means that actually the EU could decide that they want to reimpose tariffs under the provisions of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. Yet there's a whole bunch of other things that the EU could do to respond to what the UK has done or will do, assuming the bill becomes law. If you look at the TCA, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, there are a whole bunch of provisions that could still be engaged. For example, it's possible for the EU to decide that because the UK has acted in such bad faith, it's just going to give 12 months notice and terminate the TCA. It doesn't need to give a reason for it, it just needs to act unanimously. Or it can decide that it will just terminate the trade provisions of the TCA, which also means tariffs. Or it can decide that the use of the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill is such a fundamental breach of the rule of law that this is a breach of the essential safeguards, and therefore the EU might decide to suspend the operation of the TCA. So there's a whole bunch of other steps it can take. There's another half dozen, but I think those are the main ones that it may decide to use against the UK. And so all of it ultimately leads to tariffs. And what I think the striking thing is that the tariffs will be pointed, and here Alan has a lot of expertise on this, but the tariffs will be on sensitive goods. So Scottish salmon, cashmere, whiskey, and anything that's produced in red wool seats, to really hammer the point home that there are consequences of these decisions.
Thank you, that's very interesting, and it's unsurprising then that some people are playing down the significance of these changes given the array of choices open to the European Union. I don't know if Frankie or Anton want to add to that. I have a question for you as well, if I may, Chair.
Just a quick point I would add on the consequences to the points Catherine was making. Obviously, tariffs is a concern in the trade war, but I suppose specifically for Northern Ireland, the big concern would be that, as a point I made at the start, where you've got certain clauses which are being disapplied within the protocol, which are quite a lot of them. Most of them are in some way they're impacted. But interestingly, one of the clauses which currently gives Northern Ireland that free access to EU, effectively on the same terms as other EU member states, Article 5.5 in the protocol, it isn't mentioned in the protocol bill, so it's not disapplied. So our concern would be that, if you attempt to unpick certain elements of the protocol by disapplying certain parts, unless the EU agree that Article 5.5, which is the one that basically says that Northern Ireland can trade with the EU on the same terms effectively as other member states in goods, no tariffs, no customs formalities, unless the EU agree to that, and that's obviously within their gift, that's a big problem. And it brings up the question of a hard border in Ireland if you don't have the border somewhere. Border is probably the wrong word to use because obviously that's unhelpful, but if checks and controls have to happen somewhere, then you've got that problem. So that would be my big concern in terms of what the bill is doing to the protocol legislation.
Anton, do you have anything to add? But I do have a question for you, if I may, Chair, a very brief one. Perhaps I could just proceed with that, because this whole issue is seen very much as being specific GB, EU, Northern Ireland, that it is that sort of matter. I just wonder what your opinion is of the consequences of this mess, I think, for GB, Republic of Ireland relations, being slightly parochial and living in a western-facing part of Great Britain. I'm concerned that trade directly between Ireland and GB is down through Holyhead, for example, by 34%. There are broader implications, and I just wondered if you wanted to comment on that, Anton, and possibly Frankie, Chair, if there is time.
Certainly, thank you for your question. And just to add something very brief to the previous question, which was about the consequences. So I think, Catherine and Frankie set out the economic and political consequences of this bill, but I think there are huge reputational and diplomatic consequences for the UK as well, because trying to justify and legitimize a breach of international law by invoking a doctrine of necessity, which is really broad and is contrary to the UK's own policy on implementation and application of international treaties, is a very, very big thing. And it does send a very strong signal to other countries and the international community more broadly about what is appropriate behavior with regards to international treaties. It's my window, apologies. But I think so that's one aspect of the consequences that we need to bear in mind. With respect to your question about GB Ireland trade flows, I think the real danger at the moment, and with this bill, but also with the uncertainty that we have, is that it does create a lot of uncertainty for traders, and it does require a lot of thinking about all the different options and trying to adjust supply chains in quite a lot of different unpredictable ways. And uncertainty in the context of business is never really helpful. And I think one of the reasons why we've seen trade between Northern Ireland and Ireland increase is because there has been probably some changes in the way that businesses operate and try to simplify their supply chains. And we've also seen a huge shift in terms of trade between EU and Ireland by using direct ferry routes from France to Ireland as opposed to the land bridge. So I think some of those changes have been already implemented, but I think the uncertainty is definitely not going to help. And until there is more clarity about what is a more sustainable way forward, I think this unfortunately is going to dominate a lot of the business thinking.
Thank you. Unless either of the other two witnesses have anything further to add, thank you very much indeed for your answers.
Just in the interest of time, I know there's a couple of questions, Simon, but if you don't mind, I might just ask for, I guess, your own reflections to each of you just on, I guess, where we go from here. I think taking into account the EU response, taking into account maybe where we are politically, whatever that means at any point this morning, I'm not too sure. But really, I guess, just your reflections on where ideally you would like to see this go from here, particularly at a technical level as opposed to a political one. What steps would you like to see both the EU and UK perhaps taking to take this forward? So maybe to Anton first.
Thank you, Stuart. I think a way forward here is technical. I think a lot of I think the problem is political at the moment, but it's been politicized by the present UK government by introducing this bill and by sustained efforts to rewrite the protocol as a whole, as opposed to deal with the targeted practical problems that there exist. If I think about a way forward, and I wrote a whole paper on this, I think it is a combination of EU legislating unilaterally to create a set of derogations that would exempt some goods, which are, I call them Northern Ireland approved goods, but it's just a shorthand for saying some goods that fulfill some conditions from checks required under EU law for GB&I movements. And I think there, of course, needs to be some conditions attached to what those goods would be and what is the market surveillance for those specific products. But that I see as one viable approach for dealing with the question of immediate problems, but also dealing with the questions of future divergence, regulatory divergence that will come about over time and will create a new set of difficulties. Then the question becomes, how do you enforce this arrangement in practice and how do you surveil it? And I think that it all rests on fundamentally trust, but you can also try to formalize that trust in a set of governance arrangements that would allow the EU to take so-called rebalancing measures in the event that there was a serious concern about the level of risk for some of those goods flowing from GB to NI, but also a broader governance arrangement that would create mechanisms for the two sides to talk about these regulatory changes that create problems. So I think that is a way forward. And I think the solution here doesn't really have to involve redrafting the protocol. It does have to involve some changes, probably changes to the EU legislation, taking into account the unique circumstances in Northern Ireland, and a set of decisions taken by the Joint Committee that would formalize those measures within the framework of the protocol. So I think that would be a way forward that I see as viable and as both politically viable, but also that would deal with most of the practical questions that are difficult.
Thanks, Anton. And just quickly, Catherine and Franklin.
Yeah, thank you for that. I would say, I think the encouraging thing is that the EU response to the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill so far has been measured and nuanced. I was in Brussels week before last, and we talked to some of the Commission officials, and it's quite clear that their game is not punishment. I know that's become a narrative. But it's important to see it from their point of view, that they see that the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill is already a huge concession, because it's essentially contracting out part of the management of their external border to a third country. So they feel they've already made huge concessions as far as that's concerned. On the other hand, you can also see it from the UK government's point of view, that it is extraordinary to have a different set of rules that apply in one part of your country. You can't imagine the Spanish would agree to it for Catalonia, for example. So what you see is the two sides talking past each other. But the bottom line is, it's the one that we keep coming back to, that there are technical solutions, and it is possible as long as the political temperature is reduced. Now, it may be that what's happened today might have the long-term consequence of lowering political temperature, but I'm just a dull lawyer. I can't possibly foresee what how the politics may play out. But I do think it is the most important thing for all sides is to get the technocrats on it, and dare I say it, not the politicians.
Thanks, Catherine. Frankie?
Yeah, I mean, quickly, I think technical solutions could solve a lot of the problems. Anton touched on quite a lot of them there in terms of the EU amending certain elements of, say, the Union Customs Code, maybe the Principal VAT Directive, the excise rules, things like that, which are not changing the protocol. But I do think that technical solutions will only get us so far on some of these issues. Some of these issues are will require political will require trust between the parties to really stretch themselves in terms of how the protocol is interpreted in certain elements. So not necessarily rewriting the protocol, but really taking a really flexible approach to that, because we can't escape the fact that there are problems with the protocol. They're well versed, and while some businesses are managing them, those bigger businesses with lots of resources and able to invest in people and time to do that, there are a lot of businesses, small businesses, which make up a large proportion of the Northern Ireland economy, which do struggle big time with it. So I think a combination of technical solutions, but also political will to move it that step further.
That's fantastic. Thanks to you all. We're just 3 minutes over time, but I think it was a worthwhile conversation. So thank you to each of our witnesses, to Catherine, to Frankie, and to Anton this morning, and to each of you for joining us. I think it was a really worthwhile and timely session, notwithstanding what is happening in the wider political climate. So thank you so much for your time, and that we will, I'm sure, pick up again. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting us.